Hi everyone! In today's video I will be going through the Unit 4A review for our study guide in preparation for our test. You will want to have a calculator handy for this video. This is a calculator that I always use in class and what I recommend as well. So we are talking about factoring. When we go through these problems, there are a specific set of steps we are following. So I'm going to make that list over here. And I'm going to make these as brief as possible. First step is to set the equation equal to 0. Next, you want to factor, whatever that looks like. And there are a few ways to do it. First thing you want to do is look for a GCF. And then factor if it's a trinomial, a plain trinomial, no number in front of the x squared like we have on A and B, then you just factor it. And then if there is a number in front of x squared like there is in C and D, then that is when you will use that slide and divide method. Lastly, you will solve for x. So these are the steps we're going to follow in these 4 problems. 1a, x squared minus 9x equals 36. Notice that this is not equal to 0, so we cannot just jump in yet. We have to move the 36 to the left side by subtraction. And I'm going to come over here to give myself as much space as possible. X squared minus 9x minus 36 equals 0. Now I am in the position to be able to factor. Again, there's no number in front of x squared, so I can just factor it. So let's set up our factors. X, and then let's go and figure out our signs. If you remember that trick I showed you in class, it's extremely helpful. If you don't remember it, you don't like it, you don't have to use it. So you look at C first, and notice that C is negative, meaning that both of these signs are going to be different. I'm going to have one of each. And then if you look at B, that's going to tell you that the larger factor of these two, the larger number is going to have the negative on it. So I'm going to put the negative first and then the plus. And when I find my factors, I'm going to put the big one here. So let's figure out what these factors are. So we're going to make our CB table. C is negative 36. B is negative 9. Reminder, these are just factor lists. So if the numbers don't jump out at you, you can always start by just listing the factors of 36 until the right pair comes to mind. So the obvious pair, the first obvious pairing is 1 and 36. And the negative is going to go on the larger number. Obviously, I can't get negative 9 out of that. So let's think a little bit harder. Let's see, 2 and 18. Still too much of a gap here to get negative 9. 3 and 12. That is the correct pairing because 3 minus 12 is negative 9. So 3 and negative 12 minus 12 plus 3. And before you continue, always look back up at the original equation and make sure that there was just a 1 on that x squared, because when we get to slide and divide, that's a very easy thing to forget about, because if you remember in slide and divide, this would be the step where we'd come back in and divide by a if we had one that wasn't 1. So that's just an easy thing to forget about. No need to worry about it in this problem, but something to think about. So we have factored. Now we're going to split this up into 2 mini equations. X minus 12 equals 0. X plus 3 equals 0. Solve both of these. Add 12. X equals 12. Subtract 3. X equals negative 3. So these are my 2 answers. And that's it. 1b, we're going to do the same thing. This time notice that x squared is by itself on the left and everything else is on the right. I don't move the x squared over because I don't like a negative on this term. This one I always want to be positive. So I'm actually going to move both of these over. You can do this one at a time, or you can do it in one step. Just be careful when you do that. So we're going to add 6x and subtract 55. Make sure you're doing the opposites. Now, obviously, I can't combine anything, so I'm just going to write it out. X squared plus 6x minus 55. equals 0. And then again, we just factor. X. Once again, C is negative, so we're going to have opposite signs. This time B is positive, so the bigger factor, the big number, is going to have a plus. So I'm going to put the bigger number here when I find it. And I'm running out of space for my table, so I'm going to fit it in down here. CB table. C is negative 55. B is 6. Now, hopefully the right pair comes to mind a little more quickly. When we see a number repeated, usually 11 is a factor that comes to mind because 11 is what creates these types of numbers. So if I have 11, 11 times 5 will get me that. So 5 and 11. And then the 11's going to have the positive, as we've already figured out. So 5 is going to be the negative. And this actually is the pairing we need. 11 minus 5 is 6, what we're looking for. So we have plus 11 minus 5. Again, we didn't have an extra number in front of that x squared, so I'm done with the factoring part. Now I just split these up. And solve. One step each. And that's it. See? 3x squared minus 17x minus 6 equals 0. This time all of our terms are already on the left side, which is great. We don't have to worry about moving anything. But factoring is going to be a little more involved just because we got a number on the front now. So I can't just factor like I did on the first two. This is where we do slide and divide. So first thing, we move that 3 over, and we're going to multiply a by c. And again, I'm going to scoot over here just for space. So x squared minus 17x minus 3 times 6 is 18 equals 0. And then now I can factor, now that there's no number in front. Once again, C is negative, so these are going to have opposite signs. Since B is negative as well, the bigger number will have the negative on it. So we have our ACB chart. AC is negative 18 and B is negative 17. And since these are 1 apart, that's a good indicator that our factors are going to be 1 and the number itself, since there's only 1 in between 18 and 17. And it actually is the case. So again, our bigger number has the negative, so 18 will be negative, 1 will be positive. 1 minus 18 does equal negative 17, like we needed it to be. So we have x minus 18, x plus 1. Again, look up at the original problem, and this time we did have a number in front of x squared. So now we got to bring it back. Divide by that a. So I'm going to divide by 3. This is where we slide or divide. Divide if you can, if not, you slide. We can divide 18 by 3, it's 6, so 8x minus 6. We cannot divide 1 by 3 without getting a decimal, so we slide it to the front here. So we have 3x plus 1 equals 0. We're done factoring. Now we set these equal to 0. X minus 6 equals 0. 3x plus 1 equals 0. And solve. Plus 6. X equals 6. Minus 1. 3x equals negative 1. Divide by 3. X equals negative 1/3. And I'm done. D. Same process again here. We can slide and divide. Oh, and also, I haven't even taken a second to acknowledge GCF in any of these problems. So let me take a moment and do that. A and B clearly don't have a GCF because of that x squared. The number on the front is 1, so there's no way we can have a GCF. And then C and D also don't have GCFs either, if you look at them. C didn't have a GCF, 17 and 3 already. They're prime numbers, no GCF there. And then D does not have a GCF. 34 and 48 are even, and 5 is not. So we already got that to think about. So, no GCF again. So we slide and divide. So we have x squared plus 34x minus 48 times 5 is 240. And if I'm completely honest, my instinct when I saw this was to go and do quadratic formula, because once the numbers get so large, I really don't like to factor by slide and divide if I don't have to. But I pay attention to the directions. It says solve by factoring. So on the test, you have to do it the way they ask you to. So here I have to factor. I don't have a choice. So now I'm able to factor this. X's. Let's figure out the signs. Again, C is negative. Signs are different. And B tells me that the big number is a positive. So big number will go in front. ACB chart. AC is negative 240. B is 34. So since my B is a large number, I'm going to be working with some of the larger numbers here. Like, for instance, 1 and 240, the obvious pairing, there's no way. The negative will go on the smaller number. There's obviously no way I'll get 34. I will tell you, some of you will probably think, oh, 10 and 24. Because 10 and 24 give me 34. But remember, one of these has to be negative. The smaller number is negative, since the bigger number has to be positive. 24 minus 10 is not 34, so this is actually not our pairing. So let's think a little harder here. This actually took me a while of going through different factors, so I finally found the right pair. What I had to do was think of the factors of 24. So, 1 and 24, 2 and 12, so that would be for this problem 2 and 120 to get the 240, this being the negative. Nowhere close to 34. Let's go a little higher. 4, 6 times 4 is 24. So if I do 4 times 60, and then I'm going to put the negative on the smaller number again, because remember, my overall result will be a positive here. Still not what I'm wanting. Let's put the 0 on the 4 and have just 6. So we do 6 and 40. Again, 6 will be negative here to get a positive result. This is my pairing, because 40 minus 6 is 34. So it takes just some practice and some time. So really sit with it, experiment with numbers till you find the right pairing. So we have x plus 40, and then x minus 6 equals 0. Now I will tell you, if you get on the test and you just get desperate, you cannot for the life of you figure out what the answer is. Yes, you can use a different method. You're going to forfeit half of the points though. So if you do that, you need to make sure you do it correctly, because you want to get every point you can. But I would definitely treat that as a last resort. Try and figure it out the way that you're asked to do it. Okay, I found my factors. Now again, here's the part where it's easy to forget about that A that we dropped earlier. So always go back up and look at the original problem before continuing. We had a number in front, so I got to bring that back. So divide both of these by that 5. 40 does divide by 5, it's 8. 6 does not, so we're going to slide. 5x minus 6 equals 0. This is factored. So now we split. X plus 8 equals 0. 5x minus 6 equals 0. Subtract 8. X equals negative 8. Add 6. 5x equals 6. Divide by 5. X equals 6/5. And we're done. All right, that was the first section. Our next section, solve each equation by the quadratic formula. So again, you have to do it the way they ask you to. So we give the quadratic formula here. Hopefully you can read that. I'm going to write it again just in case you can't see it very well. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root. B squared minus 4ac. All of that is under the square root. then this entire thing is over 2a. I've noticed a lot of students will draw the fraction starting under the plus or minus, and they'll leave the negative b off by itself. No, it goes under the whole thing. If you write them as separate, I'm going to count it wrong. So, same kind of idea. You want to make sure this is equal to 0 before you start, just like in the problems above, but obviously quadratic formula is handled differently. 2x squared minus x equals negative 2. So first things first, we need this equal to 0. So I'm going to add that 2 over. So now we have 2x squared minus x plus 2 equals 0. Make sure you do this first, because if you label A, B, and C before you do this step, it's going to be wrong. So, A, looking at what my new equation, is 2. B is negative 1. C is 2. Reminder, that comes from ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. The key is it's equal to 0. If you were to label these from the original equation, you would have c as negative 2 instead of positive 2. And yes, that makes a huge difference. It's going to mess up your whole answer. So make sure you notice that. Now we're going to plug all these in to the quadratic formula. X equals negative, in parentheses, b is negative 1, plus or minus square root. In parentheses, b again is negative 1, squared, use those parentheses, minus 4, in parentheses, a is 2, times, in parentheses, c is 2. Whole thing is under the square root. All over 2 times a, in parentheses, which is 2. Simplifying. This takes a few steps. I'll show you this in my calculator in just a moment, but I personally like to work on paper when I'm doing these problems. Negative 1 turns us into a positive 1. Keep the fraction completely under everything. Plus or minus the square root. Negative 1 squared is positive 1, not negative 1. If you put this in the calculator without parentheses, you will get a negative 1. That is incorrect. Now remember, my trick for doing this on paper, I'll go ahead and keep the minus. And then when I do this math here, I ignore that negative. If I were to include it, I would be using it twice. You can't do that. So I'm going to cover it up, and I'm just going to do 4 times 2 times 2. 4 times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. So 1 minus 16. And then I've got that 4 on the bottom. 2 times 2 is 4. I'm almost done. 1 plus or minus the square root. 1 minus 16. That's negative 15 over 4. Before I finish up, I will show you how to do that in the calculator if that is your preferred method. I wouldn't say it's necessarily quicker because it is tedious putting it in the calculator, as you will see in a moment. I'm so clear about how to write this because how I write it is exactly how you write it in the calculator. First things first, do not put the square root in. If you do, it will actually square root it. And as you know, if we get a square root that's not nice, that's not perfect, we don't square root it, we just keep it. So don't type in that square root. Type in everything under the square root. So I'm going to type exactly what I have written here. Parenthesis, negative 1, parenthesis, squared, minus 4, parenthesis, 2, parenthesis, and then another parenthesis, and another 2, another parenthesis, negative 15. And just as an incentive as to why we don't type this in under the square root, remember, you cannot actually take the square root of a negative number because you just can't. It's not allowed. It's not possible. So if you type in the square root of negative 15, I will show you right now. So let's say you typed in the whole thing with the square root, not knowing that this was a negative 15. You'd get this. So it doesn't give you a number. You have no idea what the calculator is. So the calculator is correct. Domain error, not allowed. But that's not helpful for you when you're trying to do your math. So again, if you use the calculator, write out everything I've written here, every parenthesis, every symbol, and then do not include the square root, because then you can't actually see what the number is. All right, I am almost done. Remember, you cannot leave a negative under the square root. You have to get rid of it. So remember, the way we do that is instead of a negative, we're going to pull this out and write it as an I in front. So it's I square root 15 over 4. And just as a reminder as to why I is allowed, why we're allowed to do this, is because I literally is the square root of -1. I represents that negative that we're not allowed to have. So if we rewrite it as an I, it looks nicer. This is something we can wrap our brains around. So we do. So that's why we're allowed to do that. So if you didn't make that, and you wrote this as your answer, you would lose a point. You need to use the I instead. Remember, I only comes into play when you have a negative under the square root. If I didn't have a -15, if it was just +15, then I would have been done, and I wouldn't have had to do that. So this is my final answer. To be 3x squared equals -4x minus 10. Again, you have to have everything on one side, preferably the left side. I'm not going to move this. I don't want it to be negative, so I'm going to move everything else to the left. You can move these in the same step. Just do it carefully. -4x, I need to add 4x to move it here. -10, I need to add 10. I'm taking the opposite. I'm going to do that on both sides. So now I have 3x squared plus 4x plus 10 equals 0. Notice how I'm not adding any of this together because you can't do it. These are not like terms, just as a reminder. Now we can label ABC. A is 3, B is 4, C is 10. Again, follow the formula, symbol by symbol, letter by letter. X equals negative, B in parentheses is 4, plus or minus the square root of, in parentheses, 4 squared, minus 4 times A is 3, times, in parentheses, C is 10. Square root, this whole thing, not just the square root, the whole thing, is over 2A, and 2 times A is 3. Simplify little by little. This is a -4, it's just a -4. Plus or minus square root. 4 squared, that's 16. Minus, again, I'm going to ignore the negative and do this math. 4 times 3 is 12, times 10 is 120. So minus 120 over 2 times 3 is 6. Simplifying a little bit more. -4 plus or minus square root. 16 minus 120. That is -104 over 6. Again, if you're not sure, you can use your calculator for this step. Just do it very carefully. Type in every symbol. Do not include the square root. All right, we ran into a very similar scenario that we just did in 2A. So we have a square root here. 104 is not a perfect square, so I'm not going to do anything to it. The only concern is that negative. So let's move it out and call it I. -4 plus or minus I square root of 104 over 6. This is my final answer. I know a few of you look at these answers and think, oh, I could probably break down that radical, the square root, a little bit more and simplify it. You could. That's up to you if you want to do that. That's not our focus for this unit and this test, even though you have been taught it before. So if you want to do that, you can. Just please be careful with it. Next page. Number 3, solve by completing the square. If you want full points, you have to do it by completing the square. X squared minus 10x plus 36 equals 0. So, completing the square. First step is we want just x's on the left side, so we're going to move this c term to the right side by subtracting it. Reminder, we call this moving the junk to the trunk. So that cancels. Again, I'm going to write this over here just to give myself room. X squared minus 10x equals negative 36. Next, I'm going to set up the completing the square step. X squared minus 10x, and that's where I add the blank on both sides. Plus blank. And we're going to fill these blanks in. What we fill them in with is the b over 2 squared. So we have b over 2 squared. This is just something you do off to the side where you have room. B is negative 10 over 2 squared. Now, if you remember the trick I showed you in class, don't actually square the number. Keep the squared, but figure out what number is inside parentheses. Negative 10 over 2 is negative 5. Keep it squared. So that's going to go in this blank and in this blank. So we have negative 5 squared, negative 5 squared. Now the next step, which usually takes a bit of thought and time, you don't have to think about it all because of this trick. You have something squared. We always have an x, and then the number that goes here is the number in parentheses. This is a negative 5, so this is x minus 5 squared. If this were a positive 5, it would have been plus 5. And then over here, I've got negative 36. I will turn this into a plus 25. So I have completed the square. Now I just have to finish solving. So the first thing I'm going to do is simplify the right side. So I have negative 36 plus 25. That is negative 11. The next step, we have a squared blocking this x. We need to remove it. The way you remove a squared is through a square root. So we square root both sides. Remember, square root cancels out the square, so they cancel each other out. So on the left side, we have x minus 5, and we don't need parentheses anymore, equals. Important thing here. When you take the square root of both sides, the number that's by itself, you got to put plus or minus in front of it now. Square root of negative 11. Always include this. This is how you get two answers in your problem. All right, I'm almost done. Next thing we're going to do to finish solving for x is we are going, actually before I do that, just so we don't forget, it doesn't matter if you do this now or at the end. I'm going to go and do it now. We have a negative in front of the 11. That's problematic. Let's move it. So let's rewrite this as x minus 5 equals plus or minus. Take the negative out, write it as an I in front of it. So this is now my new square root. And then for my last step, I'm going to bring this up over here. And leave a good chunk of space over here like I am. I'm going to write in it in a moment. X minus 5 equals plus or minus I square root 11. Last step is to add 5 to both sides. X equals 5 plus or minus I square root 11. That is my answer. Alrighty. Next section, if you will. Solve each quadratic by any method. That means you get to choose. So let's write out all of these methods. I want you to think of these as like a tool belt. Each one has a specific purpose. Some of them are pretty universal, meaning you can use them in a lot of different problems, and then others are used for a very specific problem. It's important you know which methods you have available to use and when you can and can't use them. The first one is the GCF. And I'm bad about this, but always check for it. It does not come up that often, but it is very helpful when it is there. So if you can remember, always look for a GCF. The next thing that we've talked about is factor trinomials. And trinomial, reminder, means you have 3 terms. Pretty much every problem I've done up to this point, yes, all of them I've done up to this point are trinomials. 3 terms. They have 3 terms, factor trinomials. And then specifically we slide and divide. And specifically that's when a is not 1. So when you have a number in front of that x squared, that's when you slide and divide. You can technically do it when a is 1, but you'll find that's pretty pointless. So we just say factor at that point. So this one's very helpful. Next, this one's very special. So I'm going to put a star next to it. Difference of squares. And I say it's special because you rarely get to use it. So this is one of those, you have to know what this looks like if you want to use it. So reminder, that is 2 terms, not 3, 2. So it's going to be very different from a trinomial. 2 terms being subtracted. Subtracted is key. Subtracted is why it's called a difference of squares. 2 more. Completing the square. Which is what we just did. Personally, I really like this method, the downfall. You can only use it if a is 1. So if you just have x squared, like we did in the problem we just did. If I put a number in front of this x squared, now you can't use this. So I like this method. It's less work personally than the quadratic formula, but you have a limited use for it. So something to think about. Lastly, the quadratic formula. As long and tedious of a process it is, the best thing about the quadratic formula is you can use it on any of these. Any of them. Any problem in this packet that requires you to factor, you can use quadratic formula. So it always works. It's a go-to. So I know a lot of you don't like it, but you underestimate how useful it is. So as I go through these, I'm going to kind of go through this list and talk about pros and cons. All right, A. X squared minus 10x plus 13 equals 6x minus 35. First thing you want to do is locate the x squared term. It doesn't have a number in front of it. So obviously, when I get started, I want this equal to 0. So let me move these over real quick before I talk about these factoring methods. So we're going to subtract 6x and add 35. We're doing the opposites here. Now notice I've already got some of these terms over here, so I'm going to be combining some like terms. Do this carefully. So 6 has an x on it, so I'm going to put it under the negative 10x. Since these both have x, I can combine. And then 35 doesn't have an x on it, just like the 13, so I can combine those. So these are gone. Now we're left with 0. Over here, I still have x squared. Negative 10x minus 6x is negative 16x. 13 plus 35 is 48. So this is my new equation, and this is what I'm going to factor. First method, look for a GCF. First off, the first term has a 1, so there's no GCF here. Factor trinomials, 3 terms. This does have 3 terms, so that is what I'm going to do. Can't do a difference of squares here since I have 3 terms. I could just factor, I could complete the square, or I could do quadratic formula. I could use all 3 of those here. It kind of depends on the numbers. For me, I look at this and I'm like, yeah, I've got that. I can factor that. The problem is, say that these are, you get imaginary solutions. When you try to factor it, you're going to rack your brain and you won't be able to find the answer. That's because there isn't one. So if you try to factor the trinomial with that method where you just factor it, find the factors, and it's not working, my go-to is quadratic formula, because again, this always gives me the answer. Where other times I get what we'd call not factorable. Before, that's what we call it. Now we can use quadratic formula to find it. So if I get frustrated and give up, quadratic formula it is. Now, I've already done these problems, so I can tell you that you can factor it. So I'm going to do that. So let's write out our factors. And finally, I have a C term that is positive, which is a little easier because I know that both of these are going to be the same, and the B term tells me they are both negative. So now let's make my table. The CB table. C is 48. B is negative 16. All right, 48. We have 1 and 48, both negative. Nowhere near close to 16. 2 and that's 24, both a negative. Still not 16, but I'm getting closer. 4 and 12, both negative again. This does give me negative 16. Negative 4 minus 12 is negative 16. That works. So we have x minus 4 and x minus 12. Those are my factors. And then again, take a peek up at the top. Make sure you don't have a number in front that you're forgetting. And I'm not forgetting anything, so let's continue. Split this up. X minus 4 equals 0. X minus 12 equals 0. Add 4. X equals 4. Add 12. X equals 12. I'm done. B, 8x squared minus 2x minus 3 equals 0. Looking back over these methods real quick. GCF, there is none. I've got a 2 and a 3. That already tells me there is no GCF because they have nothing in common besides 1. Trinomials, again, I've got 3 terms here. So I'm going to look at factoring. Since there is a number in front of that x squared, it would be by slide and divide. Can't do difference of squares. I can complete the square if actually, no, I can't complete the square. A has to be 1. A is not 1 here. You cannot complete the square on this one. So your 2 options are factoring and quadratic formula. Now again, if you try to factor and it's not working out for you, you either can't figure out the answer or factoring actually won't work because the answer is imaginary, then you have to use quadratic formula. So again, quadratic formula is the go-to. It is not the last resort, but it's the one that will always work if the others don't. So keep this in mind. For this one though, again, this one does work out nicely, so I am just going to factor it. But again, personally, I am one who will give up and go straight to quadratic formula if the numbers get too big, because the bigger the numbers, the harder I have to think about it. All right, all of these this is already equal to 0, so I can go ahead and A times C. So I have x squared minus 2x minus 24 equals 0. Now I'm going to do that ACB table. And I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me set up my factors and my signs. Negative C means that these are opposite signs. One's a positive and one's a negative. The middle term tells me that the bigger number is going to have the negative. So I'm going to put the bigger number here. Okay, AC is negative 24, B is negative 2. Let's find the numbers. 24 is a good set of factors, but not too many to worry about. 1 and 24, the obvious pair, and the 24 will be the negative. Obviously not going to give me a negative 2. Let's find factors that are closer together. So we can do 3 and 8. Those are pretty close. That's going to give me negative 5. So let's go even closer. 4 and negative 6. 4 minus 6 is negative 2. That's what I'm looking for. So I have x minus 6, x plus 4. All right, here's the part where a lot of us forget about this. Before you split and solve, go back up to the original problem and make sure x squared just has a 1, and it does not. It has an 8. So we have to bring this 8 back in here. Divide by 8. Reminder, Here, in both of these, we have a situation where we can't necessarily divide, but we could still reduce. If you don't reduce, it's not a big deal. You will still get the right answer. But it's always good practice to notice these things and reduce. So I'm going to reduce it. Again, if you just slid it and solve for x, you would still get the right answer. So it doesn't really matter. So we have x minus, I can divide 6 and 8 by 2. That will leave me with 3 over 4. X plus 4/8 is the same thing as 1/2 equals 0. Now I'm going to slide 4x minus 3 times x, hold up, I forgot, 2x plus 1. Sorry about that. Equals 0. Now I'm going to split these up and solve. And I'm running out of space here. Here's what I'm going to do. 4x minus 3 equals 0. I'm going to do that right here. And I'm going to do the 2x plus 1 over here. The problem below it won't take us long, or it won't take up much space, so if you crowd that problem, that's fine, as I am about to do that. Add 3. 4x equals 3. Divide by 4. X equals 3/4. I'm going to write the answer up here in this space. So x equals 3/4, and then comma, I'm going to add the other one when I have it. Subtract 1. 2x equals negative 1, divide by 2. X equals negative 1/2. There are my answers. And let me box it off. There we go. C. X squared equals 2x minus 2. This is another one where before we can make any decisions, we have to have all of this on the same side, usually the left side. So let's move these. I'm going to subtract 2x and add 2 to this side. So I'm going to have x squared minus 2x plus 2 equals 0. No GCF, that's apparent because the first term is just a 1. Trinomial, so we can just factor it if we would like. And then difference of squares, can't do that here. There's 3 terms, not 2. We can complete the square if we would like. That's an option. Or we could use quadratic formula. That is also an option. Let me go ahead and spoil this one for you. A lot of you will look at that and like, oh, let me just factor it. If you try to factor it, do our CB chart. C is 2, B is negative 2. There's only one pair of numbers to give you 2, and that's 1 and 2. And analyzing the signs here, C is positive, so they're the same. B is negative, so they're both negative. Negative 1 minus 2 is negative 3. It is not negative 2. This means that you cannot factor it with this method. You're going to have to do something else. This doesn't mean not factorable. It's factorable. It's just not going to be pretty. So this is where you have 2 options. Completing the square or quadratic formula, because these will give you the answers you are looking for. And we can only use completing the square because this happens to have just x squared in it. So I personally prefer to complete the square when I am able to. If you want to do quadratic formula on your own on this problem, you will get my answer as well. So completing the square it is. Subtract the 2 over, move the junk to the trunk. X squared minus 2x equals negative 2. Now let's set it up. X squared minus 2x plus blank equals negative 2 plus blank. Now let's fill in the blank with b over 2 squared. B in this problem is negative 2. Don't square it. Negative 2 over 2 is negative 1. So that's going to go here and here. Negative 1 squared. Let's factor this down. So we have x, and then what goes next to it is the number in parentheses, minus 1. X minus 1 squared equals negative 2 plus, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this as just 1. Negative 1 squared is 1. Now we solve. First things first, I want the right side condensed. Negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1. Now to get rid of that square here, we need a square root. Again, this is going to cancel out that 2. X minus 1 equals the square root negative 1, and don't forget that plus or minus in front of it. Now, let's take care of this negative here real quick. And I'm going to take a minute to explain that, because this one is different from what we're used to. Reminder, this problem is going to be very short, so you don't need a lot of space for it. Okay. Here, we can take that out and call it I. So you have plus or minus I square root 1. Now remember, I is the square root of negative 1. Literally. So I could just write that as plus or minus I. However, if you square root of 1 is 1, wrote that at 1 as 1i, it's technically still correct. I am telling you this though because for some reason some programs, specifically Delta Math, do not like 1i. I don't know why. So it's up to you how you want to handle that. So I'm going to write it as plus or minus I, and then I'll write a note here, or plus or minus 1i. I personally don't have a problem with 1i, but some people do. I don't understand it. Okay, I'm basically done. We just need to move the 1 over. Add 1. X equals 1 plus or minus I, or 1 plus or minus 1i. There's my answer. D. GCF. There is none. 25 and 4 do not share any factors. Factor trinomial. This has 2 terms, not 3, so we cannot do that. Difference of squares. 2 terms being subtracted, yes, and these are perfect squares. The square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 4 is 2. Now, since we only have one x term, we could just add the 4 over and then just solve. That's up to you if you want to do that. I am going to use the difference of squares here. You can't complete the square because of the 25 in front of the x squared. And then, as always, you can use quadratic formula, but that would be a little excessive here. You can do it, but you don't have to. Difference of squares. Reminder, that is just when you square root the first term and the second term. Ignore the negative. Now, you have to remember what this looks like when you set it up. You have 2 factors. You have a plus and a minus. In front, you write the square root of the first term. Square root of 25x squared is 5x. Square root of 4 is 2. 5x plus 2, 5x minus 2. This is factored. Now I just split it up and solve. 5x plus 2 equals 0. 5x minus 2 equals 0. Subtract 2 on both sides. 5x equals negative 2 divided by 5. And then I'm going to list them over here since I'm running out of space. X equals negative 2/5. Solving again, add 2. 5x equals 2 divided by 5. X equals 2/5 as well. And there's my answer. Page 3. Here we have the dreaded story problems. There are 3 of them. I promise after we get through this section, it's going to be smooth sailing from here. Solve the story problems below using quadratic equations. How we factor is completely our choice. Jeremy's bedroom is 144 square feet. That's important information. And square feet should tell you area, if you did not already kind of assume that. The width of his bedroom is x feet, and the length is 7 feet less than the width. Find the length and width of Jeremy's bedroom. So a picture always helps. And I like my pictures to be pretty accurate, so I am going to think about this for a moment. The length is 7 feet less than the width. So the width is bigger than the length. So when we draw a rectangle, that's what I'm going to draw here. Typically length is this and width is this. And usually we draw it like this. But since the width is bigger, I'm going to make this side shorter and the width longer. No, you don't have to draw an accurate picture. That's just me being me. So the width is x feet. So the W is going to represent with an x. And then the length is 7 feet less than the width. So it's the width, x minus 7. 7 feet less. Area is 144. When I have the full measurement, I put that in the middle of the picture so I know that's what this measures. Last thing we need is a formula. So hopefully you remember the area formula. I'm going to write it up top here. A equals length times width. So we're just going to fill in this information. A is 144 equals L, the length, is x minus 7, times the width is x. So we have to do a little bit of work here to get what we want, what we need. First, we need to distribute that x. We're going to have 144 equals x squared minus 7x. Now, we need to have all the terms on the same side. I know we're not used to working on the right side of the equation, but we're going to be okay. Move the 144 over here by subtracting it. It's going to give us 0 equals x squared minus 7x minus 144. This is what we need in order to solve. So, I'm looking at this. 144 for me is where I start to get a little uncomfy trying to find the factors by hand. Not a fan. Doable, but this just, no. So this is where I just want to rage quit and I go, you know what, let's just do quadratic formula because I know it takes a little bit of time, but I can use my calculator and I can figure it out pretty quickly. So let's do that. So let's label our ABC. A is 1. B is negative 7. C is negative 144. Formula, let me write that out for reference. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. X equals negative, b is negative 7, plus or minus square root, b again, negative 7, squared in parentheses, minus 4 times, in parentheses, a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 144, all over, whole thing, over 2 times a again, which is 1. X equals, simplifying it down, negative 7 is just a positive 7, plus or minus the square root. Negative 7 squared is positive 49. Again, I like to throw this negative in here and then ignore it when I do the math. 4 times 1 is 4, and then 4 times 144 is to be determined. 4 times 144 is 576. Now, I didn't put the negative in there with my calculator, but since I have a negative here, this is actually a negative 576. All over 2. Simplifying some more. 7 plus or minus square root. Let's figure out what this is. So, 2 negatives in a row make it a plus. This becomes 625, which, believe it or not, that is a perfect square. That's 25. So that's going to give me 7 plus or minus 25 over 2. Reminder, when we get numbers, so no square roots, we can actually get answers. So this is where you separate them. And you figure out what the numbers are. So you have 7 plus 25 over 2. And 7 minus 25 over 2. 7 plus 25, that's 32. Divide that by 2, that's going to give us 16. 7 minus 25, that's going to give us negative 18. And negative 18 divided by 2 is negative 9. Now, something you should remember about story problems, they are special. Anytime you have a story problem, you can pretty well guarantee that negative numbers are not allowed. Because in the real world, we don't deal with negatives. Hardly ever. So, you cannot have a negative measurement in a bedroom. It's not possible. So, when you have a negative and you're doing a story problem, go ahead and cross it out. 16 is our answer. Now, it's not our final answer because the answer was what is the length and the width, not what is the value of x. So, tiny bit more work to do, and I'm clearly running out of space. So, the width, as you can see in my picture comparison, was just x. So, w equals 16, which was our value of x. And then the length equals x minus 6, or 16 minus 7. So it's x minus 7. So 16 minus 7 is 9. What's nice is it is very easy to check your answer here. Because if I plug these numbers in for length and width into my formula, I should get the area, which is 144. So let's see. Is 16 times 9 144? Yes, it is. So we got the answer we were looking for. All right, 2 more of those. Letter B, very similar context here. The length of a rectangle is 1 less than twice the width. So let me back up here. Length of a rectangle, so we're still doing a rectangle. 1 less than twice the width. The area of the rectangle is 45 square centimeters. Find the length and the width again. So draw a picture. This time, the rectangle is 1 less than twice the width. Twice the width already should tell us that it's larger than the width. So I'm going to draw a traditional rectangle this time. And to conserve space, I'm going to draw it over here. So again, we have a relationship with the length, so width is just width. So you can use x here if you want, or you can use w for width. Up to you. I like to use w personally. Length is 1 less than twice the width. Twice the width is literally 2w, and 1 less than that is minus 1. Area is 45, so I'm going to put 45 in the middle. We're going to do this exactly the exact same way that we just did A. So, area equals length times width. A, area was 45, equals the length, which was 2w minus 1, times the width, which is just w for width. So distribute that w. We get 45 equals 2w squared minus w. Again, we got to have these all on the same side, so let's move the 45 over by subtracting it. 0 equals 2w squared minus w minus 45. From here, we just factor. These numbers are a bit smaller than the problem in A, so I feel more comfortable with slide and divide here, so I'm going to use that. Slide and divide because I got a number in front of that w squared, so let's multiply A times C. We're going to get 0 equals w squared minus w minus 90. And let's make that ACB chart. I'm going to go and set up our factors while I'm thinking about it. Let's see. C is negative, so these are going to be different signs. Our number here is negative as well, so the bigger number is negative, the smaller one is positive. AC, that's negative 90, and B is negative 1. Since my B is 1, negative 1 technically, that tells me that the two numbers I multiply together to get 90 are very close together. So that's something to think about. So obviously 1 and 90 is going to be a stretch. And that would be 1 and negative 90. It's going to go in the bigger term here. There's no way that's negative 1. So let's think of numbers that are closer together that give us 90. When you think about it, there aren't that many. There's 1 in 90, 2 in 45, which is not that close, 3 in 30, closer but not quite. And then the obvious one, since this ends in 0, you can divide it by 10, 9 and 10. 9 and 10 are 1 apart. It has to be. Since it's a negative 1, 10 is going to get the negative. And there we go. 9 minus 10 is negative 1. So we have W minus 10 plus times W plus 9. Before I move on, I almost did it. Look back up to your original, which is this here. Make sure there's not a number in front like there is, and take care of it. So we need to divide by 2. 0 equals W, 10 divided by 2 is 5, so minus 5. And then W. Now, we can't actually divide these because we get a decimal, so we're going to slide that 2 to the front. So we have 2W, I already forgot again to slide first before I started writing. 2W plus 9. Now I can solve these and get my answer. W minus 5 equals 0. 2W plus 9 equals 0. Add 5. W equals 5. That's probably going to be my answer since it is the positive one. Subtract 9. 2W equals negative 9. Already you can see I'm going to get a negative here. I'm going to get negative 9 over 2, which is not allowed in story problems. So 5 is my width. So remember, this 2W minus 1 is actually the length. So W equals 5. That's one of my answers. And then length L is 2W minus 1. So let's plug in the 5 for W. 2 times 5 minus 1. 2 times 5 is 10, minus 1 is 9. So L equals 9. Again, a very quick way to check your work is multiply these back together and make sure you get your area. Most of you don't need a calculator to know that 5 times 9 is 45. So we are good. One more story problem, and then we're done with story problems. Number 6. Same direction. Solve using quadratic equations. Audrey throws a basketball from a height of 3 feet. I can underline this stuff. It's really not important. I'm just going to read. With an upward velocity of 8 feet per second. The function, this is the important information. H of t equals negative 16t squared plus 8t equals plus 3. Gives the height h of the basketball after t seconds. After how many seconds will the ball hit the ground? So if you want to draw a picture, you can. Audrey throws the basketball from a height of 3 feet. That's not that tall, so we'll make Audrey a short girl over here. And she's got a basketball. She threw it. And it sounds like by the directions it's going upward. Not that this is important information, but she threw it up. It's going to go up a little bit longer. And then obviously what comes up must go down. Goes up must come down. We want to know how many seconds it is in the air. How long does it take to hit this level? And that's going to be in t. How many seconds did it take for it to hit the ground? So this, of course, is when the height is 0, because the height is 0 when it's on the ground. So pretty much what you would expect to do. Take your equation, set it equal to 0, and solve what we've been doing for this entire study guide, pretty much. Negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 3 equals 0. I prefer these problems, honestly, because, I mean, once you've seen one, you've seen them all. There's not much thought here. Take your equation, set it equal to 0. And the answer we're looking for is t. So once I find t, I'm done. So let's see what we're working with here. We have a number in front of t squared, so I can't do completing the square. So I can either factor with sign divide, or I can do quadratic formula. And factoring this isn't that bad. So I'm going to factor, do slide and divide. So let's multiply a times t. So we have t squared, bring that negative with it, plus 8t minus 48 equals 0. All right, set up our factors. Instead of x, we have t's. C is negative, so signs are different, and then b is positive, so the bigger. This is why I curve my t's. If you haven't noticed, they look like plus signs if you don't. And then b is positive, so the bigger number is going to be a positive number. AC/B chart. AC is negative 48. B is positive 8. 48. Again, 1 and 48. 2 and 24. 4 and 12. And let's take a look here. Just kind of been throwing out factors. Okay, bigger number's positive, so these are going to have the positive, so these are going to be the negative. I have found my pairing. Negative 4 plus 12 is 8. 12 minus 4 is 8. So my factors are t plus 12 and t minus 4. Once again, before you split and solve, come back up and check. Do I have a number in front? Yes, I do. It's negative 16. Slide or divide. Again, I can't fully divide, but I can reduce. So let's do that. Now, because of this added negative here, we're going to be careful when we do this. So let's first focus on just simplifying. 12 and 16 can divide both by 4. That's going to be 3/4. Now, I can save myself a little bit of trouble here by going ahead and putting the negative up top. A negative fraction is negative regardless of where the negative sign is. So I'm going to put the negative on top with the 3. And then over here, these negatives cancel and make a positive. So I now have plus. And then I've got 4 and 16, divide both by 4, that's 1/4. Now let's say you didn't deal with the negatives and you slid this forward with the negative in front. You're still going to get the right answer, so don't worry about that. Last but not least, slide. 4t minus 3, 4t plus 1 equals 0. Set these both equal to 0 and solve. I'm going to do that over here. 4t minus 3 equals 0. Add 3. 4t equals 3. Divide by 4. T is 3/4. This is my positive answer, so this is more than likely going to be right. But let me go ahead and just do the other one just in case. 4t plus 1 equals 0. Subtract 1, and I end up with a negative. 4t equals negative 1. Divide by 4. T is negative 1/4. Again, in story problems, not allowed. T is 3/4. That's my answer. I am done. Done with story problems. Simplify the following squared binomial expressions. FOIL. It's a lot of stuff. Let's talk about it. Squared. Seen that before. Binomial just means 2 terms instead of 3, like a trinomial. Expressions means there's no equal sign. We aren't solving for x here, so do not solve for x. All I want you to do is basically get this, expand it, is another way to put it. And they're telling you to FOIL. Foiling, if you don't remember, is an acronym telling you the order in which to multiply the terms. It goes first, outside, inside, last. I showed you guys this is basically double distribution. I like that explanation because when we have larger expressions, that's what we're doing. FOIL only works for things of this size. So, first thing you need to do, and you're going to do this on all of these, is you're going to rewrite this as the term twice. X plus 3 squared is the same thing as x plus 3 times itself. That's literally what squared means. From here, you're going to multiply, double distribution. So, you multiply the x first, do that twice. Distribute the x first. X times x is x squared. X times 3 is 3x. Now we distribute the 3 twice. 3 times x is 3x. 3 times 3 is 9. Reminder, you will end up with 4 terms. The 2 middle ones always can be combined. X squared, 3x plus 3x is 6x. So plus 6x plus 9. This is your answer. That is all you can do with it. A, notice they're all named A, funny. 2x minus 3/4 whole thing squared. We're going to make this a little more complicated, adding in fractions. Just take your time with it. Really take your time on these problems. Distribute the 2x twice. 2x times 2x is 4x squared. 2 times 2 is 4. X times x is x squared. I'm going to pull out some Post-its for these fractions. I do not have the space to show that on here, unfortunately. 2x times negative 3/4. So let's deal with the numbers first. 2 times negative 3/4. When you multiply and you have a whole number, remember you can just put this over 1. Multiplication is straight across. So that's going to give me negative 6/4. Normally I would go ahead and reduce, but I'm going to have to do some extra work anyway, so I'm not going to change that. I'm just going to leave it as negative 6/4. So this gives me negative 6/4. Now don't forget about that x. You can do one of two things with the x. You can write this as negative 6/4 x on the outside, or negative 6, put the x on top with the 6/4. I personally prefer the first option, so that's how I'm going to write it. These are the exact same thing. You can put x on top, or you can leave it to the side. Okay, I've distributed the 2x. Now let's distribute the negative 3/4. Negative 3/4 times 2x. I just did that. Negative 6/4 x again. And then now negative 3/4 times itself. Again, multiply straight across. Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9 over 4 times 4 is 16. So that's a positive 9 over 16. So we have our 4 terms, middle ones combined, because they both have x. 4x squared. Now we're switching to adding and subtracting fractions. Be careful with this. Unlike multiplication, you do not just add or subtract straight across. The denominator stays the same. So we know we're going to have something over 4. And then, because they both have an x, I'm just going to put it here. We're just figuring out the numbers right now. Negative 6/4 minus 6/4. Really, what we're just trying to figure out is what the top number is going to be. Negative 6 minus 6 is negative 12. So this is negative 12/4. I'll put the negative in front. Again, you can put the negative on top, middle, or bottom. Middle is what I always do. Bring down that plus 9/16. And if you want your brownie points, you can simplify the 12 over 4 to 3. 4x squared minus 3x plus 9 over 16. That's the fully simplified answer. All right. Last one here. This one's going to be a doozy. We got 2 letters involved. Split it up. X minus p over 5 times x minus p over 5. Double distribution. And actually, I'm going to offer an alternative way to write this real quick. So, because when we throw in extra letters, some of us get a little worried. So we have p over 5 here. Now, just like I showed you, you can put the letter on top or to the side. So this, if I write it to the side, means I have a 1 on top here. So, another way to look at this is to rewrite this as x minus 1/5 p, x minus 1/5 p. That's up to you, how you want to write it. Both are correct. So I'll leave both of them here. How you do it is up to you. So double distribute. X times x, that's manageable, x squared. X times negative 1/5 p, not difficult. Minus 1/5 p, attach that x at the end. When you multiply letters, we just smush them together in alphabetical order. Double distribute the negative 1/5 p. Times x, again, minus 1/5 px. Last term, negative 1/5 p times negative 1/5 p. I'm going to do that over here. Negative 1/5 p times negative 1/5 p. So we end up, if we worry about the numbers first, negative 1/5 times negative 1/5. Multiply straight across. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. 5 times 5 is 25. Don't forget about the p's. P times p is p squared. Just like how x times x is x squared. So then, you can write that as 1 over 25 p squared. And that's a positive. 1/25 p squared. Combine the middle terms. X squared minus, we have 1/5 and 1/5. Think about it. It's 2/5. Minus, because they're both negative. But remember, when we do addition or subtraction, it's just straight across. Negative 1 minus 1 is negative 2. 5 does not change. Px. Then I'm going to bring this down. Plus 1/25 p squared. Now, one thing I'll caution you to. Honestly, I'm about 50-50 on this, on whether the test says this or not. So there is a good chance that the final answer in the test will have the letters back on top. So here's the other way to write this, is you just put the letters on top. So we have x squared minus, and I'm just going to smush this all together, 2px over 5. Now since this is a 1, I'm just going to replace the p squared with it, plus p squared over 25. It would help if I show you that. So, letters on top, letters to the side. They're the exact same answer. It will be shown to you in one specific way on the test, but just understand that they mean the same thing. So, when I'm doing the math, I like it to look like this. For a final answer, I really don't have a preference. It's kind of up to you how you want to write it. But I'd keep an eye out for this one on the Post-it note, on the test specifically. All right, last page. The good news is it should be the quickest one. Discriminant. Remember, the discriminant is hidden inside of the quadratic formula, so we're not going to give you the quadratic formula on the test. Or sorry, we will give you the quadratic formula on the test. We won't specifically tell you what the discriminant is, but if you know that the discriminant is what's under the square root, it's there. So let's fill out this table real quick. Value of the discriminant. What kind of number is it? B squared minus 4ac when it is greater than 0. Numbers that are greater than 0 are positive. So we have a positive number. B squared minus 4ac equals 0. That means that it's 0. B squared minus 4ac is less than 0. That means it is a negative number. So if you're not getting it, I'm getting it from this piece of information here. That's how I can tell. Now, we did discuss this in class. If you have a positive number or a negative number, you have 2, and then leave a space here. 2 solutions. 0 is the only time that you will have 1 solution. We have to specify number and type. So positive or negative will have 2 answers. 0 will have 1 answer. Now type. There are 2 types of solutions. There are real solutions and there are complex. And complex is just a fancy word for imaginary. We're not going to get too far into that in this class, but if you go to pre-cal, you will learn all about that. Type means real or complex. The only time you see complex is when you get a negative answer out of this. I'm going to go ahead and fill that out. 2 complex solutions. So that's when you're going to have that I show up. If you have a positive or a 0, that's when you're going to have real answers, real numbers. No I's involved. So think about it this way. Negative is what you don't want. You don't want complex answers. Complex answers, they live up to their name. They are complicated. And unfortunately, they're not something you can even check with a calculator. That's why they are even more complicated. These real solutions are things that we can see we can actually work with. A calculator can comprehend these things. So a positive number will give you 2 real answers. 0 will give you 1 real answer, and a negative will give you 2 complex imaginary answers. So you do need to be aware of those 3 categories. So we're going to do a couple of examples with that. Find the value of the discriminant and determine how many roots and type of roots of the following quadratic equations. So we're going to find the discriminant first, figure out what that number is. Reminder, your discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. So let's label, and this is equal to 0, so it's ready. A is 1, b is negative 5, c is 12. So b squared, we have negative 5 squared minus 4, a is 1, c is 12. Negative 5 squared, that's positive 25, minus, ignore that when I do this math, 4 times 1 is 4, times 12 is 48. I can already see that this answer is going to be negative. Negative what? Let's see. 25 minus 48 is negative 23. So, discriminant is negative 23. I'm pretty sure these blanks go with A and these blanks go with B, just an FYI. How many roots? If it's not 0, like an answer of 0, then it has 2. 2 roots. Types. Negative discriminant tells you we have complex. You can also say imaginary. You write that a bit better. Imaginary. There we go. Repeat that with this problem here. It's equal to 0, so we can go ahead and plug these in. A is 4, B is 20, C is 25. So we have b squared, 20 squared, minus 4 times a is 4, times c is 25. 20 squared, that's 400. Minus, ignoring that when I do the math, 4 times 4 is 16, 16 times 25. Let me see what that is. That is 400. 400 minus 400, that's 0. The discriminant is 0. 0 means we have 1 root, but these are still real roots because it's not negative, it's 0. So 0 still gives us real numbers. That's awesome. That's it. Number 9, our last problem. These are identical problems. They're going to be solved the same way. Let me read it first and I'll explain what we're doing here. In the equation 2x squared minus 9x equals k, k is a constant. If the equation has no real solutions, which of the following could be the value of k? Must show work to receive credit. So what we're doing is we are playing around with different values of what will eventually be our c term to find the one that will give us this result. No real solutions. The only category that does not give us real solutions is the negative category. So what we're going to do here is we're going to find the discriminant. We're going to plug and chug till we find the right one. And we want to get a discriminant that is negative, because that will give us no real solutions. So I'm going to put up here, want negative. And pay attention to that in the directions, because depending on what situation they want is going to change what you're looking for. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go through and I'm going to do these one at a time until I find the right one. So, A is 0. So I have 2x squared minus 9x equals, that means I'm going to put 0 in for k. And then over here, this is going to be its own category. This is me doing the b squared minus 4ac. So let's find a, b, and c. There is no c. So for option A, that means I have a equals 2, b equals negative 9, and c equals 0. Let's plug these in. B squared, that's negative 9 squared, minus 4 times a is 2 times c is 0. Negative 9 squared is positive 81. Be careful there. Minus 4 times 2 is 8 times 0 is 0. So 81 is my discriminant. I want a negative discriminant, so A is not my answer. I'm going to repeat this process till I get a negative number out of this. Option B. 2x squared minus 9x equals 8. Be careful here. When I go about labeling, C is not 8. I have to move it over, set this equal to 0. So let me do that. 2x squared minus 9x minus 8 is 0. Now I label A, B, C. A is 2, B is negative 9, C is negative 8. Again, B squared minus 4AC. In parentheses, B is negative 9 squared, minus 4 times A is 2, times C is negative 8. Negative 9 squared, that's positive 81. Minus, I'm going to be careful here, cover up that negative while I do the math. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times negative 8 is negative 64. Two negatives in a row here make it a plus. 81 plus 64, believe is going to give me 145. Yes. That's positive. I want negative. So B is not my answer. Let's try C. Option C, we're going to let that be negative 20. 2x squared minus 9x equals negative 20. Again, we need to add that over before we label. 2x squared minus 9x plus 20 equals 0. A is 2, B is negative 9, C is 20. Okay. B squared minus 4AC, let's try it. We have negative 9 squared minus 4 times A is 2 times C is 20. Negative 9 squared, still 81. Minus, I'm going to cover that up. 4 times 2 is 8 times 20 is 160. 81 minus 160, I know that's going to be negative. It's going to be quite a bit negative. That is going to be negative 79. This is what I'm wanting. I want a negative. So C worked. C is my answer. Negative 20. 9b, it's this exact same process, but read it carefully. In the equation, 4x squared plus 12x equals k. K is a constant. If the equation has two real solutions, this is different from what I just did. Which of the following could be the value of k? Two real solutions happens when you have a positive, so I want a positive. Now just throwing this out here, if it said it had one real solution, we would want 0. So again, knowing these categories is important. We want positive here. So now I'm just going to repeat that exact same process. Reminder, our formula is b squared minus 4ac. That is the discriminant. So we're going to try option A, which is negative 9. We have 4x squared plus 12x equals, we're going to let k be negative 9. We're going to add that over before we label. 4x squared plus 12x plus 9 equals 0. A is 4, B is 12, C is 9. Let's test it. B is 12 squared minus 4 times A is 4, C is 9. 12 squared is 144. minus 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 9, 144. 144 minus 144 is 0. That is really close, but not what I'm looking for. I want a positive number, not 0. So A is not my answer. Let's try B. Negative 8. 4x squared plus 12x equals negative 8. We need to add that over before we label. 4x squared plus 12x plus 8 equals 0. A is 4, B is 12, C is 8. Let's try it again. B squared, 12 squared, minus 4 times A is 4 times C is 8. 12 squared is 144 minus, multiply without that negative in front. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 8 is 128. 144 minus 128 is definitely a positive number. Let's see what positive number it is. 16. 16 is a positive number, which will mean I will have 2 real solutions. That's what I want. B is my answer. That is the end of our study guide. I hope this video was helpful. I am so sorry for how long it took me to go through everything. It's got a lot to it, but I hope this helped clear up any confusion that you have. If you still have questions after watching this video, feel free to watch it as many times as you want. Feel free to reach out to me via email or in person before you take your test. Otherwise, I hope you have an awesome day. Bye!